The Duke had way more to do with this than we are able to prove. But his association with these people, the monetary benefit he would get if Oakes was killed, the fact that he tried to screw up the investigation by, calling it a couple of knuckleheads for Miami, this guy had so much more to do with this. He knew about it, he didn't do anything about it, and then once it had happened, he tried to cover it up because he knew that there was financial gain for him. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. We are doing Traitor King today because we didn't get to it on Sunday. I had grades and comments due, and that took up my entire weekend. So, didn't get to do my little side project here, sadly. But you guys, this chapter is worth the wait. I truly believed we had come to the height of all we were going to find out, and that, now that we've sort of reached the middle of the book, it sort of peter off in the interesting details. Like, surely he'd shared everything that was worth knowing. No. Suddenly, we get a true crime chapter dropped right in our laps. An actual murder has taken place, and the Duke is involved. What? Scandal, 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 people. What in the world is this man's life? Okay, so it's a long chapter, very detailed. I'm probably going to be doing a lot of reading from the chapter and less telling because there's just so many details, and I don't want to drop anything or make it confusing by me stopping and talking constantly. I mean, I'm still going to comment, obviously. But there's just a lot of details, and I want to make sure I deliver that in a way that is understandable. So best to read from the text. But all I can say is get that cup of tea, get those cookies, sit down, get some popcorn, whatever your little snack is. This is not a clean and listen episode. This is a sit down with a snack and indulge. Okay, here we go. Chapter 14, it's called Murder in Paradise. Okay, on the morning of Thursday, the 8th of July, 1943, a bloodied corpse of Sir Harry Oakes was found in his bed at Westbourne, one of his homes in New Providence. He had 4 distinct triangular-shaped wounds by his left ear. He had been set alight. Feathers from a pillow were scattered over the body, and his genitals had been almost burnt off. Although he lay on his back, there was blood running across his face, suggesting he'd been moved after the fatal blows. A set of false teeth still sat in a glass of water on the table next to his bed. Shocking. Now, we've heard of Sir Harry Oakes before. He was somebody who had enormous power on the island, was very wealthy. In fact, the Duke and Duchess had stayed in one of his homes when they were having their house renovated. Remember when they first got to the Bahamas and they were like aghast at the quarters in which they were being forced to live. And so they had been living in one of Sir Harry Oakes' residences while their house was being renovated. So that's the first time we've heard about him. We know he's a powerful player. So he's not a new character to us. But this is certainly some new information. Now, who discovered him? Harold Christie at 7 a.m. came and woke him up, well, tried to wake him up, to get him up for breakfast. Apparently, Harold Christie, who was a very dear friend to Harry Oakes, had stayed the night because there was this terrible thunderstorm, and so he was just going to stay the night. And he discovered the body, and weirdly, he says that he comes in, finds his friend's bloody corpse on the bed, and offers the bloody corpse a glass of water. Okay, this book contains photos of the crime scene. There ain't no way that person was alive. Nobody in their right mind would have offered this body a glass of water. It is very clear he is not alive. Realizing that his friend and business partner is no longer alive, he makes a series of phone calls to Madeline Kelly, the wife of Oakes' business manager, who lived in a cottage nearby, to his brother Frank, and then to Reggie Erskine Lindop, the commissioner of the Bahamas Police, and finally to the government house. So he calls all these people, the police, and so-and-so and so-and-so, and he makes a call to the Duke. Well, Gray Phillips gets the call, and he goes and wakes up the Duke. And he tells him the news at 8 a.m. So just an hour has passed. And unsure what to do, the Duke immediately imposed a news blackout, but he was too late. The editor of the Nassau Gazette had already been told, and he had begun to file the story. The question soon began to be asked. What was there to hide? Like, why was the Duke like, no one can talk about this, everyone shut down? What is that about? The Duke then made a decision for which he was to be heavily criticized. And as we go on, you will see why he was heavily criticized. It's a terrible decision. Serious crime, according to him, was rare on the islands, and he later argued that he did not feel that the local police were sufficiently experienced to investigate. The obvious decision would have been to call on Scotland Yard, or if he felt that they were too far away, the FBI or even the local RAF base. Okay, I just gotta make one little point here. He says serious crime was rare on the islands. In this chapter alone, we're going to talk about multiple murders, revenge killings, intrigue, cloak and daggers. I mean, it's like rare. This place seems like the most unsafe place I've ever read about. Anyway, continuing on. He says, oh, you know, the police don't know how to handle anything. I better call the police in Miami. What? Okay, so instead of calling the actual authorities, he decides that he's going to call the head of the Miami City Police Homicide Department, Captain Edward Melkin, with whom he had dealings on his American trips, saying he needed help to, quote, tidy things up a bit. Those aren't the right words. Melkin, a veteran of over 500 murders in his almost 20 years with the force, immediately jumped on a plane, bringing with him Captain James Barker, the head of the fingerprint squad. That's important. By early afternoon, they were at Westburn. Now, what in the world do these two jokers have any business doing in the Bahamas? How can they investigate this case? They are from Miami. They're from, like, another country. How does this even make sense? And I want to know why David had even had any dealings with the Miami City Police Homicide Department Captain Edward Melkin in the U.S. Why would that be somebody he knew and had palled around with enough to call in the event of an emergency? The police investigation was flawed from the beginning. Yeah, you don't say. The house was not sealed, and much of the evidence was disturbed by the numbers of people who had arrived when they heard the news of the death. The police quickly identified a suspect, Harry Oakes' son-in-law, Count Alfred de Madeny. He was a playboy in his early 30s, and he was twice divorced, and he'd only just recently married the eldest of Oakes' 5 children, whose name was Nancy. By the way, she had only just turned 18, so questionable, questionable, questionable. This guy in his 30s marrying this girl who just literally turned 18? What a cad. Anyway, relations with Sir Harry were strained, and de Madeny was felt to have a motive for killing Oakes. He had been near Westburn at the time of the murder. The hairs on his arms were scorched by fire, and he was unable to produce the shirt and tie he'd been wearing on the night of the murder. And you know, on the surface, that all seems like, yeah, where are your clothes? And why wouldn't you know what you wore last night? And how do you not know? How did you lose your shirt between now and then? What is that about? And why are you burned? You know, so there would certainly be quite a number of things to make you wonder, especially because this guy just had a really bad reputation, just as a human being. De Madeny owned a yacht, the Concubine, that name alone, on which he won many races, and he also smuggled goods. An FBI background check on de Madeny revealed that the Bureau had conducted some investigation in the past of de Madeny, during which some evidence was developed indicating that he had been engaged in the illicit traffic of drugs. There was no need for the Duke to become involved in the investigation, but on Friday the 9th of July, he appeared at Westburn and had a private 20-minute conversation with Barker. Remember, that was the fingerprint guy who'd come from Miami. No record of what was said was kept. 2 hours later, de Madeny was arrested and charged with the murder of Sir Harry Oakes. If found guilty, he would hang. Murders were bad for tourism, obviously. And de Madeny, he didn't have very many friends among the officials in the Bahamas, and he was a very convenient scapegoat. But to compound it all, I mean, he was an unlikable soul in the first place. But the Duke had specific feelings about de Madeny. He hated that guy, and for the most petty of reasons. I mean, they just didn't get along. But to pin a murder on this guy was low, even for David. The Duke reported immediately to the Colonial Office that the 2 Miami detectives had rendered most valuable service by their relentless investigation, which had in large measure resulted in the arrest of the accused. And what he had not bothered to say was that there was considerable history between himself and de Madeny. De Madeny had no respect for the governor and did enjoy taunting him, and did so often. One time, the English actress Madeleine Carroll was there filming a movie, and the Duke had dearly wanted to have her for dinner, but de Madeny scooped her up and had her for dinner instead. And then another time, the Duke was outraged because he was charged an outrageous price for a bottle of cognac when he had been expecting to receive the bottle for free. And so, in his mind, this young joker with all his wild ways there needed to be some comeuppance. How dare he have that actress over for dinner? And how dare he charge him for a bottle of cognac when he should have just given it for free? Didn't the boy know his place? But more stupidity ensues. In the past, the two men had also argued about the treatment of some prisoners who had escaped from Devil's Island. And then there was a kerfuffle about a visa for de Madney's yachting coach, which I guess the Duke would not arrange. The final straw had been when the Duke refused to be the guest of honor at a fundraising dinner for the dependents of Bahamian servicemen overseas, with which de Madney was involved. Like, none of these are good enough reasons to be like, hey, we don't know who killed Oakes, but that joker over there has gotten under my skin for quite some time. Let's take him down. Of course, the Duchess herself, old Wallace, has got on a letter writing campaign trying to make sure that the narrative is correct. She writes to her Aunt Bessie and it's like, it's crazy around here, you know? People are insane, but we don't have anything to do with it. She said, I am afraid there's a lot of dirt underneath, and I think that the natives are all protecting themselves from the exposure of the business deals, strange drums of petrol, etc. So one wonders how far it'll all go. Most unpleasant, as I do not think there's a big enough laundry anywhere to take Nassau's dirty linen. Tisk tisk, says she. But as we get on into the book, strange barrels of petrol have nothing to do with anything. I mean, what in the world is that weird little statement thrown out to sort of cause confusion? Anyway, we're going to find out some things. In mid-September of 1943, the Windsors made their fourth visit to the United States in spite of objections from the British Ambassador Lord Halifax. But they did so because they wanted to make sure that nobody thought they were putting their nose into things. They were trying to distance themselves from all the proceedings so that everybody else could do the dirty work and they could be like, we don't know anything about it. Now, when they were in the U.S., one of the highlights of the trip was visiting the FBI to see the exhibit rooms, communication section, laboratory, firearms range, and identification division, where they were shown round by J. Edgar Hoover himself. The couple visited art galleries, service canteens, and navy yards, inspected training units at Harvard, and reviewed naval troops at Newport, Rhode Island, where they dined with Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Again, why? Why any of this? Why are they always being shown around like their approval is needed? But the book goes on to say their timing was deliberate because shortly after they left, the trial of Alfred de Madney opened. The evidence against him looked strong, not least the discovery of his fingerprints on the bloody Chinese screen in Oak's bedroom, a room that de Madney was supposed not to have visited, but the prosecution's key evidence soon began to unravel. Captain Barker, remember that's the fingerprint guy, only announced the discovery of the fingerprint to his colleague when he and Captain Melkin saw Lady Oakes at Oak's funeral several days after the print had been discovered, and long after de Madney had been arrested. Yes, why are we just now finding out about this fingerprint? You know, and why would you announce this very pivotal part of the investigation, this incredibly important bit of evidence, to the widow of the deceased at the funeral, but long after the investigation is all but closed up and the guy that you say did it has been arrested? Why are we just now being like, and by the way, his bloody fingerprints were found all over everything? What? Okay, like, a couple of newbies over here running this operation. What in the world is this absolute jumble? The fingerprint produced in court had supposedly been lifted from the screen, but on cross-examination, it became clear that the detectives were not sure from where it had been taken on the screen. Kind of something you want to remember. It then became apparent from the patterns behind the fingerprint that it had actually been lifted from a water glass, a glass given to de Martigny when the detectives were interviewing him. We can throw out the fingerprint evidence then. This is the thing that we need to know. This fingerprint guy was a big question mark himself. There was an FBI file on this guy. And according to that file, Barker, who had started his police career as a traffic cop and clerk, had been suspended for drunkenness and demoted for insubordination, and had close connections with organized crime, especially Mayor Lansky, also known as the mob's accountant, and instrumental in the establishment of illegal gambling in the U.S. So not exactly the sort of person you'd want on your side if you're trying to have a up-and-up investigation. Now, de Martigny's defense lawyers were able to explain away the burns on his hands from lighting candles in hurricane shades, and his friend was able to provide an alibi for the night of the murder, saying that he had spoken to de Martigny at 3 a.m. in the flat that they shared. It was, however, the planted fingerprint evidence that was to be decisive. Circumstantial evidence initially looked pretty bad for this guy. You know, you don't know where you were the previous night, you don't know where your clothes are, and you got burns on you, and the body had been burned and all this. I mean, it didn't look good for him, and his character certainly did not speak well for him. But that sloppy fingerprint garbage, I mean, he should have been released that very minute. On November 14th, just after over an hour's deliberation, the jury, by a majority of 9-3, returned a verdict of not guilty. It was clear the authorities, especially the governor, did not want DeMartini around. The next day, he and his friend were ordered to be deported. Writing to the Colonial Office that day with copies of newspaper editorials, Heap noted of one of the Bay Street Boys factions, "The Solomon Gang are out for blood, and we may expect another committee of inquiry by the House. The general opinion is that DeMartini is guilty of the murder, but the Chief Justice could only sum up in his favor on the evidence produced in court." So though he was found not guilty, the people in power in the Bahamas, that being the Bay Street Boys, certainly wanted to pin with all vigor the crime on DeMartini's back. They did not want that guy to get off with it. And the thing is that it's going to continually be stated that he was the true murderer. He's the true murderer. That guy's the one who did it. But there's no evidence whatsoever. And yet there's an enormous amount of evidence for another suspect. We'll get to it. 10 days later, the Duke, in a telegram to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, added of DeMatney that he was, quote, an unscrupulous adventurer, a gambler and spendthrift, suspected drug addict, suspected of being concerned in the unnatural death of his godfather, Ernest Braunard, etc., etc. I mean, isn't this the pot calling the kettle black? An unscrupulous adventurer, a gambler, and a spendthrift. I mean, a suspected drug addict. Well, David, you're an alcoholic, so I think perhaps you should just stop pointing fingers. Anyway, ridding the colony of the two men proved more difficult than anticipated. The War Office refused to provide transport, and the American authorities denied visas for travel via Miami. In the event, it was not until early December that DeMatney and his wife Nancy sailed to Havana, and the finca of their friend Ernest Hemingway, where Nancy proceeded to have an affair with Hemingway's son Jack. Oh, just an absolute viper's nest of fools. The trial and verdict had been a disaster, though, for the Duke, showing his lack of authority and judgment and revealing how he had tried to frame an innocent man. He and Wallace always stressed in subsequent interviews that they had deliberately not involved themselves in the case, but in the Royal Archives, a cryptic letter from Melkin to the Duke, written shortly after the couple returned to the Bahamas, ran thus. And this is the most cryptic letter of all. I'll read it slowly because I read it a couple of times and I was like, what does this even mean? Melkin, if you'll recall, was the captain from the police department in Miami, from the homicide department, and he'd come with his fingerprint guy, Barker. And Melkin wrote to the Duke and said, "The enclosed is self-explanatory. There are many things I can enlighten you on, and will be glad to do so at your request. Some of the things deal directly with the conduct of members of the Assembly, both in civil life and in their conduct in this case. And those things should also be investigated, as well as the members who had knowledge of and were parties to some of the things. I told you of one matter." Okay, that's as vague can be. But essentially what he's saying, when he talks about the Assembly, what he really means is the Bay Street Boys. And he's saying, those guys are trouble. And they have their fingers all up in this murder. And nobody's ever really going to know what happened because they will make sure that nobody knows what happened. So he's pointing a finger at the Bay Street Boys. And we should be pointing fingers at the Bay Street Boys because they are the ones who did this. One specific member of their little group. The enclosure is missing, but it suggests Melkin privately knew more about the likely culprit than history has recorded. Now, poor DeMatney, unscrupulous cad and fool that he was, should not have been stamped as a murderer because there was a much better suspect. One candidate remains particularly strong. Harold Christie, the man who found the body, the friend who stumbled into the bedroom to wake up his friend for breakfast, sees the bloody corpse on the bed and tries to offer the body a drink of water. I mean, an absolute idiot if ever there was one. I mean, that is like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Well, that's why I have blood on my hands. I try to wipe his face clean. I try to offer him a glass of water. What an idiot. Okay, well, it's question mark with this guy. And stick with me, guys, because his motivations are shady and sort of unclear, but it all has to do with money. Now, a little background on this guy. He's a native of the island. Like, his family had been there for generations, since the mid-18th century. And he was now regarded as one of the most prominent citizens. And he was a member of the Bay Street Boys. He had made a fortune buying up beachfront properties from poor farmers and redeveloping them for British and American investors. But there was a darker side, with a police and FBI record as a bootlegger going back to 1923, when he'd been charged with the illegal transferring a schooner from the American to the British registry of ships to make it easier to smuggle alcohol into the U.S. He was a key witness in this murder, being the person who quote-unquote found the body. And it's all a lot of mystery with him, because one could ask, though he had been sleeping a few doors away from Oaks, he claimed to have heard nothing. Was he in a drunken stupor? How are you going to not hear somebody who's being attacked and whose genitals are being burned off? I think that might have caused a little bit of a kerfuffle. Again, the question I've been asking, why did he offer Oaks a glass of water on finding the body when it must have been clear the magnet was dead? Was he actually at Westburn that night? How did he explain the sighting of an old school friend, Captain Edward Sears, the head of the Bahamian Police Traffic Division, of him in a car in the center of Nassau at midnight on July 7th, supposedly with his brother Frank? Yeah, how was he spotting people at midnight when he was supposedly in the bed, asleep? Also, the question was asked, why did he park his car at the country club rather than outside Westburn if he was not to use it until the morning? And why? Okay, and those last two questions, I mean, that's a little bit annoying for those questions to be raised when we haven't been given anything about his testimony thus far. So apparently there was questions about where he'd parked his car. That didn't make sense. And why he was saying he was spotting people when supposedly he was asleep over at Westburn, but we don't have any of his testimony. So I'm a little annoyed at the author for raising questions about his testimony when we didn't even hear his testimony, but whatever. The thing too, though, that we want to ask ourselves is, why were the bloodstains found in his bedroom not investigated? How do you just skip over that? How are you like, hey, your friend is, bloodied and dead in the bed, but question upon question, why is there blood in your room also? You're not hurt. How'd that blood get there? Nobody bothered to ask those questions. The thing is, he had far more motive than DeMadney. Christie certainly had motive. There were rumors that he had double-crossed Oaks in a property deal, and in revenge, Oaks had called in Christie's IOU notes, sought repossession of Christie's only fully owned asset, the island of Lyford Cay, and talked of planning to move to Mexico, taking much of his business with him and thereby ruining Christie. What no one doubted was that as a key figure amongst the Bay Street Boys and a member of the executive council, Christie was not someone who was ever going to be fully investigated. He could do whatever he wanted. No one was going to call him up. And it makes complete sense that Christie's would want to get rid of Oaks. If Oaks had turned on him because of having been double-crossed and was like, I'm going to plow you under, you son of a bitch, yeah, you can almost see that there's way more motive here. If everything financially was going to be taken away from Christie, of course he was going to try to find some way to keep all he had. He clearly had no morals, and nothing was going to stop him. As a member of the Bay Street Boys, he's already shown to us that he lacks any moral fiber. So this doesn't shock me one bit, but it gets so much deeper than just, hey, this guy's going to take everything from me. There were great plans to take Oak's fortune from him. But other mysteries remain. Before we get into all of that, there's other things we have to discuss. DeMadney's friend, Basil McKinney, himself to be charged the following year with smuggling drugs into the islands, so not a super credible witness, but he said that he saw two watchmen at Lyford Cay, and they told him that they had seen a cabin cruiser arrive at 1 a.m. on the night of the murder, and two men were being collected by car. They returned an hour later. But, according to DeMadney, shortly afterward, one of those men drowned, and the other one was found hanging from a tree. Were these hitmen brought in from the outside? Were these two men who were later killed, had they been brought in to kill Oaks, and then were they themselves killed? Questions linger. Why was the Commissioner of Police, since 1936, Reggie Erskine Lindop, a policeman of great experience and integrity, taken off the case and transferred sideways as the commissioner in Trinidad? That's very, very weird. And he later, upon being interviewed, said that DeMadney was an unprincipled rascal, but he did not kill Oaks. My investigation had just reached the point where, during the interrogation of a possible subject, I extracted information that I am sure was a clue to the murder of his accomplice, when the case was taken out of my hands and I was transferred to Trinidad, and I was not asked to give evidence at that trial. I mean, scandal and intrigue, my friends, scandal and intrigue. Why in the world were policemen from Miami brought in when Reggie Erskine Lindop was completely capable of conducting the investigation? And, you know, people are going to be being killed right and left. These Bay Street boys. This is not the first time they've meandered into the dark waters of intrigue, murder, cover-up. You know, this seems to be the way they roll. So for the Duke to have previously said, you know, there's just no crime on this island. You know, there's nothing's going on. So the police wouldn't be able to investigate this appropriately. You know, I got to call in my friends from Miami. That doesn't even make sense. There's all kinds of stuff going on all the time. And Reggie Erskine Lindop was completely capable of taking care of it. But as soon as he showed his capabilities, and as soon as he showed that he was going to find the answers and not just paper over the whole thing, transferred to Trinidad. And who was the one who made sure he was transferred to Trinidad? The Duke! Yes, 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 David shows up. David shows up to continue to cover for himself. It was largely on the insistence of His Royal Highness that we moved Lindop and landed Trinidad with a problem, states the Colonial Office report re-examining the case. Why was the Duke so keen to shut down the story? Well, I'll tell you. In July 1942, a secret State Department memo had noted that Axel Wenner-Gren had $2,500,000 frozen on deposit in the Bahamas, and it had been made at the express request and in part for the benefit of the Duke of Windsor. That's the Duke's money, but he can't use it yet. This was money that the Duke hoped could circumvent currency regulations and either use in America or invest in Mexico. He had plans to buy a villa there, safe from the ravages of war. Oakes and Christie had also invested heavily in Mexico through the Banco Continental set up by Wenner-Gren in June of 1941 in the hopes of protecting their money from the war and consolidating their fortunes. According to Pat Verheim, who had studied the case, a careful accounting of Oakes' estate at the time of his death came up $15 million short. Oakes had put that money into Banco Continental, supposedly created as a stash house for Nazi war loot being moved out of Germany prior to the end of the war, along with money put there by Christie and the Duke. My interpretation, if not the overt suggestion, was that when Oakes was killed, only Christie, the Duke, and Maximo Camacho, the banker and brother of the President of Mexico, knew of Oakes' money stashed there. The conclusion then was that after things had cooled down, they realized that money was free for the taking and split it. That would have put an extra $5 million into Christie's pocket for his real estate developments and another $5 million into the royal coffers when the Duke returned to England. Finances certainly seem to have connected many of those associated to the murder. When investigators called into Madney's apartment on July 8th, they found him with John Anderson, an accountant who was responsible for Wenner-Gren's business after the Swedish tycoon's blacklist. The Miami police investigator stated that Anderson had been questioned regarding the Madney's possible connection with Axel Wenner-Gren, and when this subject was brought up, Anderson became extremely nervous and did not volunteer any information. The investigators felt that Anderson had some possible tie-in with de Madney and Wenner-Gren, and they viewed his operations with suspicion. Anderson was interviewed about the murder, and he told the FBI that Christie and Wenner-Gren brought in the Duke of Windsor into a plot to divert millions of dollars to Mexico to be exploited there after the war. And the FBI report continued and said that Anderson does not know where the records were kept or how, but Wenner-Gren let it be known that he was holding $2,500,000 for Windsor, some of it the Duke's money, all of it available to him, which is all unthinkable that former King of England might have a hand in all of this. So it seems that the murder was not just as simple as de Madney, for whatever reason, wanting to take down Oakes. Like, there was just never any good reason why de Madney would kill his father-in-law. Not at all. Really, like, never have we ever been given any good reason why he would want to do that, other than, you know, things were prickly between the two of them. Well, yeah, probably because you married his 18-year-old daughter. You know, she literally just turned 18, and then you got married to her like the next day. I imagine things were rather prickly. But after all of that, it's absolutely Harold Christie who had a hand in things. Because he has all the motives to do it. All of his money's going to be taken away from him if Oakes stays alive. Because Oakes is going to plow him under because he'd been double-crossed in that real estate deal. You know, and so Oakes was coming calling. you know? So he's going to become a pauper if Oakes stays alive. But if he can kill Oakes, then not only does he get to keep everything he has, but he also gets $5 million that Oakes had stashed away in that Mexican bank that no one knew about. Now, there are people who are going to want answers, because nobody's getting the right answers here. Madney was said to be not guilty by the court of law. So, you know, he should never have been, the fingers never should have been pointed at him in the first place. But we wasted all our time and energy putting on trial an innocent man. Meanwhile, it's an open secret who really did it, but we all know that's never going to go to court. Nancy Oakes wanted to know who had killed her dad. And so she, though she stood beside her husband in the trial the whole time because she knew he hadn't done it, she still wanted answers. So she brought in a private detective at $300 a day plus expenses to conduct his own investigation. This man was Raymond Schindler, if you've ever heard of him. He was the most famous and the highest paid American detective of the day. He said, "It is my considered opinion that the murderer of Sir Harry Oakes can be found, identified, and convicted and brought to justice." And he wanted the Duke's help in doing so, but the Duke politely declined. Are any of us surprised? The detective was not put off, speculating in the magazine Inside Detective shortly afterwards that the body had been moved to the bedroom and that there was a voodoo element. This guy, Raymond Chandler, I think, possessed all the abilities to solve the case, but I think he was a little bit of a sensationalist. I mean, being interviewed for a magazine called Inside Detective and saying the body's been moved from one bedroom to another, which is true, but this bit here about there was a voodoo element. And the thing is, I think there was. Those triangular marks, those perfect triangular punctures on his head, the burning off of his genitals. I mean, like, none of this is like a clear cut, like, let's just go and kill the guy and get out, you know? It was a weird, almost torturing of the body. The following month, Christie met with an FBI officer to find a New York private investigator to re-examine the murder paid for by contributions of a few influential people in Nassau. And an FBI report of August 1944 thought that, in view of Oakes' background, it might have been committed by some of the big-time mobsters with whom Oakes had previously been associated. And in the spring of 1945, the FBI were tipped off by Scotland Yard of possible additional evidence of a, quote, native of the Bahamas who was presently in the United States. But they were not interviewed. The inference was that this was Harold Christie. So I think it's interesting that Harold Christie would be communicating with the FBI, being like, yeah, let's find out who did this. And then nothing ever comes of it. And the FBI is told by Scotland Yard, Harold Christie's the one. And yet, no one can seem to pin anything on this guy. A slippery one is what he is, slippery. In August of 1946, a new governor, Sir William Murphy, asked the Colonial Office to reconsider the evidence against Madney, and Scotland Yard conducted a review of the case, but only on the basis of the trial transcript. They concluded that, in our opinion, Madney was the murderer, and with great respect, we think that the case was mishandled. There should have been a conviction if the facts had been investigated and put before the court in a proper manner. There was no purpose in reopening the case, especially after Madney could not be retried, and it suited everyone's purposes to let sleeping dogs lie. How could they come to the conclusion that Madney was a murderer based off of the trial transcript? The trial transcript is so jarbled and so confusing because the evidence that's being set forth is so pithy, unimportant, and tampered with that I can't even understand how you could read all that and then come to the conclusion like, well, I mean, the guy was guilty, but I mean, let's just like, we can't do anything about it now. How could you even come to the conclusion that he was? Throughout the years, more evidence would come out that it was Christie. People would know things, and no one can keep a secret, and people would continue to put forth, hey, I heard this, and hey, I heard this. And the author of this book details some of those examples. In September of 1950, Edward Mahava, a seaman on holiday in California, was arrested for drunkenness and claimed that he'd been told the name of the killer by a society portrait painter, Mrs. Hildegard Hamilton. Mahava told him that Christie had paid a Bahamas hitman. And that kind of goes with that story that Madney's friend told about those two hitmen who were seen, you know, being taken by water cab to and from an island, and then suddenly those two guys are killed. You know, sort of goes with that. The next month, the Washington Star quoted a woman who claimed, everybody in Nassau knows who did it and why, but he's so powerful nobody dares touch him. According to the unnamed woman, the actual slayer was the son of a white father and a black mother, and that he acted only as the hireling of a powerful plotter. Again, the hitman theory. The lawyer Felix Cohen wrote to the British Embassy in Washington in November 1950 after a colleague, Betty Renner, who was supposedly looking into the case, was murdered, complaining that the authorities were turning a blind eye to various murders and witnesses felt intimidated about coming forward. So continually we're hearing, hey, you can't have an open and honest investigation here because the fat cat's running the show. Is anybody going to care to hold these people to justice? 3 years later, a local American hotelier, Daniel Cusick, told the FBI that the Bahama Islands are controlled by Harold and Frank Christie, and that one time somebody had shot him, and he felt confident that it was Christie's hired gunman. The FBI said they could not help as they had no investigative jurisdiction. Why is it that the FBI has no investigative jurisdiction into this? Which I believe that they don't. Yet a couple of policemen from Miami could come down and try to throw somebody in prison. Where was their jurisdiction? Why were they allowed to do that? The full-length study of the murder, The Life and Death of Harry Oakes, was written by the Daily Express journalist Jeffrey Boca in 1959. Weirdly, he was helped in his research by Christie, and initially by his former employer, Lord Beaverbrook, who had a house in Nassau. But during the course of the research, Beaverbrook suddenly withdrew his support, and he said, "I'm opposed to the book about Oakes," he wrote to his former protege. "I disassociate myself from it altogether because of the implications and relations to other people." But Boca, who had planned to name Christie, which I think is crazy, like he's asking for Christie's help, but then he wants to name Christie. So what? Did Christie not realize that? Subsequently suggested that the killers were a syndicate of financial adventurers involved in an intricate plot to get their hands on Oakes' fortune. Well, I do think there's something to be said for that. I do think it was a group of people who were like, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if Oakes was killed. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if nobody knew about that money in his bank account and we got our hands on it, But I think that Christie was at the head of that plot, and I think Christie is the one who made it happen. The Boca book stimulated new interest in the case. In March of 1959, Canadian television transmitted a program on the murder. On June 8th, Raymond Schindler wrote to the Bahamian Attorney General saying that the Duke had been responsible for a cover-up. But strangely, after Raymond Schindler said the Duke has covered this up and helped to cover it up, 2 days after that, Charles Bates, a legal attaché at the U.S. Embassy in London, sent an FBI report dated May 28, 1959, on the case to Hoover. And that report to this day remains closed. The Duke had way more to do with this than we are able to prove. But his association with these people, the monetary benefit he would get if Oakes was killed, the fact that he tried to screw up the investigation by, calling it a couple of knuckleheads for Miami, this guy had so much more to do with this. I'm not saying that he personally hired the hitman. I'm not saying that he, had stayed up late planning how this would happen. What I'm saying is that he knew about it, he didn't do anything about it, and then once it had happened, he tried to cover it up because he knew that there was financial gain for him. On July 8th, Nancy Oakes was interviewed at Scotland Yard on the understanding that her information would not be made public without her permission. On the following month, a Scotland Yard memo concluded that, quote, one or more of the beneficiaries might have been responsible for the death of her father, naming as the hitman a former narcotics officer in California called Stanley E. Halstead, who had known Oakes in his mining days. Later, in 1959, Cyril Stevenson, leader of the Black Progressive Liberal Party and editor of the Bahamian Times, began a campaign for a reopening of the investigation. He said, "I'm prepared to say that, in my opinion, Oakes was killed by one of his close friends, Christie, and he had no reason to suspect his friend." 24 hours later, after saying this in the paper, 4 shots were fired into the office where he usually worked. He wasn't killed because he didn't have to be there at the time. But for all intents and purposes, somebody was trying to murder him for saying, "I think Christie had something to do with this." Now, the string of weird deaths begins to unravel. And this is what I'm saying. Y'all gonna try to tell me that this island is a safe place? Duke, Duchess, please. Christie's former secretary, 60-year-old Dorothy Maxey, was raped and murdered in 1962. And authorities were quick to say it had nothing to do with anything, but she was only one of them involved in the case who met weird and sudden deaths. Sir Harry Oakes' heir, Sidney, his eldest son, died in a car accident in 1966, which you could say, well, these things happen, but there is talk of a faulty drive shaft and possible interference with the car. Meanwhile, Oakes' other son, who admittedly did suffer from serious mental illness and would run around the house barking like a dog and peeing on the furniture, died of alcoholism, but there was quite a suggestion that it wasn't actually alcoholism that killed him. but that someone felt the need to silence him forever and pinned it on his alcoholism. I mean, you know, a lot of this is hearsay and cloak and dagger and all this. You know, you could say that, oh, the former secretary who was raped and murdered, that didn't have anything to do with Christie. Oh, his son dying in a car accident, that didn't have anything to do with Christie. Oh, the fact that his other son died and, you know, the raving lunatic was an alcoholic anyway, so it didn't have anything to do with Christie. But it's like, well, but all of those people, with, I guess, exception to the secretary, stand to have benefited from his death financially. Both his sons should have received something from his estate, and the secretary would have known, most likely, quite a lot about his business dealings. You know, she is his personal secretary. So if anybody stands to have been murdered, it would make sense that those three would have met at their demise. Now, what of Harold Christie? Whatever happened to that fat cat? Well, in 1959, age 62, he married a divorcee 20 years his junior. His business interests prospered. He eventually became chairman of the Bahamas Development Board, and he was knighted in 1964. They just throw out those knighthoods now, don't they? But the increasing public suggestion of his involvement led Christie to issue a statement through his lawyers threatening action against anyone who accused him. This book came out called King's X, which accused him. And he had a big stink about that and tried to get his lawyers all mixed up in it. And then he said, okay, fine, you can publish it. But the next time, the second round of publishing, when this book goes out, I get to have a statement in it. But of course, no one came knocking at his door the second publishing round to say, hey, could we have that statement now? You know, so that sort of just fizzled out for him. The mystery remains unsolved, even if it seems that the real culprit's identity was an open secret. At a party in the south of France in the 1960s, Diana Mosley heard Lord Beaverbrook ask Christie, "Come on, Harold, tell us how you murdered Harry Oakes." Christie smiled and said nothing. A scandalous way to end that chapter. Wasn't that a good one? Intrigue, intrigue, intrigue. Crazy, crazy. There's a part of me that is like, how is this even possible? How in the world has David fallen so far from any mode of human decency? But if we look at the trajectory of his life, why would we be surprised that he would be involved in the murder of a cover-up that would have resulted in him gaining $5 million? I can't say I'm super shocked by it, you know, and I think that he most likely calmed his conscience by telling himself, I don't have anything to do with any of this. You know, it's just something that happened and now I have to handle it, you know. And I'm sure he felt that because he personally didn't pull the trigger or call a hitman or any of this, you know, he was just going to sort of sit back and let people do what they were going to do. And then, you know, he'd help tidy things up a bit, as he told that one guy. Are you kidding me right now? Tidy things up a bit? I mean, like, that phrase in and of itself is so questionable. I can't even believe that people weren't up in arms because of that, you know. Basically, what he said is, hey, I need to cover something up. Can you help me? Wild. Wild behavior. Anyway, that's the end of that chapter. We'll be covering a big chunk of Worthy later this week. Got to get that over with. Next week, I want to start the Britney Spears book. Although, okay, you guys, listen. Yesterday, I posted on the community tab on my page. So if you didn't see it come up in your notifications or whatever, you can go over to my channel and under the community tab and vote. I've had so many people asking me to do that what is it called? End over. I don't remember what the book is. Could care less about it. I mean, like, not even one tiny part of me wants to review that book. Not even one tiny part of me. But there's all these people who keep talking about it. And look, I know what buttered my bread. It was talking about Harry and Meghan. The channel did really well when I was doing books about that. And so there's a part of me that's like, should I feed into the madness and cover this book that is just so much drivel because it's written by somebody who is not a good source? Or should I just continue on? So do we want me to cover the Obi Scobid book, or do we want to talk about Britney next? This is the thing. I've had a lot of people be like, I want Britney, I want Britney, I want Britney. And so do I. And then I've had a lot of people like, well, I never really like her music or anything like that. I was never really into Britney. Neither was I. But like, her public demise and her like very clear struggles with, you know, her mental health and relationships and her family and all of this, that seems interesting to me. So that's why I want to cover it. Anyway, those are our options for when we're done with Worthy. If you would do me a favor and go over there and vote. Right now, it looks like we're trending towards we still want Britney. And there's a ton of people covering that Scobie book. So if you really care about hearing about it, I'm sure there's tons of people who would give it to you. And I'm sure that I would do a fine reading of it, but I just really don't want to waste my time on somebody's book who I feel like just isn't a good source. He's not a credible journalist. And so I just feel like wasting time on what he has to say. Like nothing that we learn about in that book can really be trusted in any credible way. You know, so it's like when we read Spare, we knew what we were getting. And I feel sort of similarly about this book, but it's almost worse because it's not even straight from the horse's mouth. Like if I'm going to listen to a bunch of drivel, I'd rather listen to it straight from Harry or Meghan's mouth than it being like packaged and like somebody tries to make the crazy drivel sound appealing to me. Like I don't want that. Anyway, that's just how I'm at. I'm at I want to do Britney, but if you guys would rather something else, again, I will do that. Okay, anyway, go vote if you have a chance. And I will see you later, and we'll be like rushing through the rest of Worthy because I'm so over that book. This next chapter on that book, you guys, it's all about like, she calls her children the little gurus. And I mean, it's almost worth talking about just because her parenting style is so crazy. But anyway, we'll get into that. I'll see you guys later this week. I hope you have a great one, and we'll talk later. Bye-bye.